Welcome to Leading in Luxury, the podcast where we cut through the noise to bring you the sharpest strategies for success in the boutique and luxury hospitality sector. I'm your host, Daniel Renna. In an industry where margins are tight, competition is fierce, and customer expectations are at an all-time high, how do luxury establishments truly differentiate themselves and maximize profitability? Today, we're uncorking the secrets of high-performing beverage programs with a true industry titan, Brad Nugent, co-founder of Innovative Beverage Strategies. Brad, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me on, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. For our listeners, could you please introduce yourself and give us the elevator pitch for Innovative Beverage Strategies, or as you cleverly call it, IBEVs?
I'll just give you my brief background story, if you will. So I've been working in and around restaurants since 15 years old, for the better part of the last 25 years or so. I moved to Manhattan when I turned 18 to go to college. I was a theater major. I was working in a restaurant just to make a little bit of extra money and, put myself through college basically, and sort of caught the wine bug at about 20 years old. So I had to wait a year to go to wine school because I had to, become of age. Yeah, I had to wait to be legal. So I pursued the first three levels of WSET and, got an internship at Balthazar. And this was in 2004-ish, something like that. Got an internship at Balthazar, worked there for a year for free. And then I got my first SOM job after that and sort of took off. Most recently I was working with Major Food Group, the powerhouse that is Major Food Group, and their sort of expansion since COVID. I was running beverage for them in the Northeast. In 2024, full year 2024, I oversaw 8 properties and about $64 million in beverage revenue across 8 different restaurants. COVID was a real game changer on a lot of different fronts, right? It really changed the industry in ways that I think we're still feeling now. But over the course of COVID, I was having so many friends, industry friends, reach out to me, owners, operators, GMs, people that I'd worked with in the past, people that my path had crossed with over the course of my career. They were reaching out to me for help because they couldn't hire anyone. They couldn't find anyone on the beverage front to, reopen their restaurant, whether that was a SOM or a wine director. And, what started out as kind of just a little side gig to make a little bit of extra money to put my son through college, quickly kind of became a real opportunity. I realized that, hey, there's a real thing here. So hence, Innovative Beverage Strategies. So me and my business partner, Patrick Wirt, we started the company in 2023, and we really provide, fractional beverage direction to restaurants, on the complete catalog of beverage. So wine, liquor, spirits, beer, house cocktails, the whole thing. Both of our passions is wine. We've both worked in wine our entire careers. We have a lot of experience around it in a lot of different markets and a lot of different types of restaurants. We've obviously worked in lots of high-end spaces and lots of, fancy restaurants, but we've also worked for and with a lot of regular single store owner operator, 40 bottle wine lists, mom and pop shops that just need help, right? That they would never be able to hire anyone who has expertise and experience and can actually move the needle for them.
Well, that's a powerful and much needed solution. So here on Leading in Luxury, our goal is to bring our audience, who are often leaders and innovators in this space, the most cutting edge insights. So Brad, your journey from a theater major to overseeing $65 million in beverage revenue is remarkable. What was the absolute critical moment or insight that made you realize this side gig would become a full-fledged business, filling a massive gap in the market?
I think it was the realization that, people couldn't hire for the job any longer, whether it was a SOM or a beverage manager or a beverage director. And even if they could hire, even if they could find someone, that person is gone in 6 to 12 months, meaning they move on. They get bored, the job gets stale, they lose interest, whatever it is, they move on to the next best thing. Maybe it's a money consideration, but there's no continuity and there's no expertise on the business side of beverage programs in general. So I think that was the moment over COVID, coming out of COVID, where I really said to myself, I think we have something here. I think that, I can basically do what I'm doing for Major Food Group for any restaurant. I can oversee from a distance and I can direct and I can strategize.
I mean, you definitely identified a significant blind spot in the industry. So you mentioned that restaurants to a large degree are still in the Stone Age. when it comes to certain operations. What are the top 2 or 3 most common pain points or critical inefficiencies you consistently find in beverage programs within luxury hospitality establishments? How does iBevs immediately address them?
So, I mean, I preach this all the time, but the biggest gap that I see across beverage programs, particularly wine programs, particularly high-end wine programs, is pricing. I think pricing represents the largest opportunity in front of any owner or operator, no matter the scale, no matter the scope. I think truly reevaluating pricing structure and applying pricing strategy is the lowest hanging fruit imaginable. Forever, you mentioned the Stone Age, right? Where are restaurants in the Stone Age? So, restaurants typically use a metric called cost of goods sold, COGS percentage, right? This is the gold standard. And I always preach that, COGS isn't a strategy. COGS is an outcome, right? COGS should not inform your pricing decisions. COGS should inform how your pricing decisions made you money, if that makes sense. So, typically the most common thing I see is operators marking things up, products, wines, spirits, cocktails, whatever it is. They mark them up 3 to 4 times to try to achieve, a 25 to 30% cost of goods sold, because that's what they're budgeted for. And, on the surface, that's fine, right? There's plenty of programs out there that are just chugging along and doing okay, but they're not optimized, right? They're looking at the wrong metric, basically. COGS only matter where you have transactional velocity, where you are selling things. Everywhere else, COGS do not matter. So, the most apt point is the high end, right? If you take a $20 bottle of wine wholesale cost and you apply your metric to it, it's going to hit your wine list at $80 to $100, that 4 to 5 times markup. You're going to achieve, 20 to 30% cost, depending on what you're doing, right? But maybe in your ecosystem, in your restaurant, in your location for your clientele, maybe $100 bottle of wine is a really expensive bottle of wine, right? And maybe that restaurant that we're in, maybe your transactional average is really only 50 or $60, right? You're selling $50 and $60 bottles of wine frequently, most often, and you never get any traction on that $100 bottle of wine. So this is where the concept of profit comes in, right? On that $60 bottle of wine at a 25% COG, we're making $45 in gross profit, right? So now you have that $100 bottle of wine that never moves, and you're trying to make $80 in gross profit on it, right? So this is our strategic pricing strategy, right? So you take that $100 bottle of wine and you lower it to $75, right? It costs you $20. Now you're trying to make $55 in transactional profit, which is more than what your average is.
Right.
So when you sell it, you're moving the needle in the right direction from a profitability perspective. But what you're also doing is creating perceived value. You're opening the door to engagement. You're inviting a guest to come in and recognize that that $75 bottle of wine represents a value on your wine list. And that creates engagement. And engagement creates conversation. And conversation creates sales. And, from that conversation, you give yourself an opportunity to generate a regular, to generate a client that is going to come back to you because they feel like it's worth it. So, to put a bow on that, where are restaurants in the Stone Age? Pricing. It's almost always pricing.
Right.
They do not think about it the right way. And everything that I'm suggesting is very, very simple and straightforward. It's difficult to execute. It takes a lot of work. When I started with Major Food Group in 2018, I printed this massive wine list in that building every single Friday. And every single Friday, I changed prices. Prices went up, prices went down. The list was never static, right? It moved. And that was a ton of work, but it bore a ton of fruit for that restaurant because there was a constant intrigue and engagement surrounding the wine list in that building.
So in the end, that's a critical diagnosis, not being able to understand how the pricing goes. You also touched on the idea that in today's market, the middle has become decimated. Meaning guests are either opting for quick service or high-end experiences. For a luxury restaurant struggling to translate its value proposition into sales, especially with beverages, what's the one non-negotiable shift in mindset or strategy that they need to implement to thrive in this polarized market?
Through the lens of the middle, I think the middle suffers now in general, now, granted, we're making very broad generalizations here, right? But I think the middle suffers right now because it's largely mediocre, right? It's just okay. If you're there are really good restaurants and really bad restaurants and restaurants that live in the middle. And that value proposition for guests is awful, right? Like what I see currently, what the trend I see currently is that the entry level restaurants are doing really, really well and the high end restaurants are doing really, really well. So that tells me that when people go out, they're either choosing to spend a lot of money on something that they perceive to be worth it, or they're going out for the quick fix to get something cheap because they don't want to cook at home or they don't have time or whatever the reason is, right? And that middle is suffering the most. So, one of the pieces of advice I give to, operators that sign on for our service or, that we work with currently, right, is, excellence is a non-negotiable. You have to approach everything in your store through the lens of we're going to be excellent. I liken it to the kitchen a lot. My business partner and I talk about this all the time. The concept of systems and preparedness and, doing the work before the doors open, right? In a kitchen environment, if you're a serious kitchen with an excellent culinary program, there's no room for unpreparedness, right? Stations are set up, proteins are portioned out, meat is prepared and ready to go, plates are in the warmer, right? There's multiple people in that kitchen looking at everything constantly to make sure they're ready, to make sure that they can maximize the 5 hours you have at night to generate all the revenue you need for the day,
Right.
basically, right?
Yeah.
And, we tell operators that they need to look at their beverage side the same way, that the bar just isn't like cutting some lemons and limes and, polishing some glasses, right? It's like, are your low boys stocked? Do you have backups? Is wine cold? Are glasses polished, right? You need to look at it the same way that you would in a serious kitchen. And that's, why we say excellence is a non-negotiable. It's like you have to enter Thunderdome, if you will, right? That 5 hours of service is like, all I'm going to do for the next 5 hours is sell product. And what do I have to do to get ready to do that?
I love that quote, excellence is non-negotiable. So that's because, I
Yeah.
mean, at the end, what are you doing it for, right? If your customers aren't coming in.
Like there was, I watched recently a podcast with Will Guidara, right? Will Guidara being the, ex owner of 11 Madison Park and, has wrote a book called Unreasonable Hospitality. And he's very much a hospitality sort of guru, but he
Mhm.
was saying that at 11 Madison Park, excellence was table stakes, meaning everyone walks in the door and it's assumed you're going to be excellent. Like that's where that's where you begin, right? And everything is built off of that. Now at, 11 Madison Park is an obviously very special, very unique restaurant, right? But I think there's a version of that for every operator.
No, absolutely. That is the clear mandate for excellence. So you also highlighted earlier, you talked about the devastating impact of COVID on the restaurant workforce, particularly the missing middle of experienced managers. How does this talent gap directly affect the profitability and operational integrity of luxury establishments? And what innovative solutions is iBev's deploying to counteract this widespread issue?
It's a good question. It's a deep question. What I see most often is, some of the hardest jobs to hire in any restaurant currently is floor managers, general managers, beverage managers, beverage directors, even sommeliers to a certain degree. Bartenders, servers, depending on your market, they can be difficult too, right? We lost so many people over COVID, just leaving the business, right? Transitioning out and moving somewhere else. And all of those people were those sort of middle tier people, right? Maybe you had been a server for, 4 to 8 years or something like that. Maybe you were thinking about taking the jump into management, right? So you had a lot of hands-on restaurant experience and then you sort of transition to a management role and then you sort of work your way up the ladder. So we lost the middle of that feeder system during COVID. And so, it's very, very hard to hire those jobs. And the people that get put in those jobs may or may not have the experience level needed to be effective, right? And one of the things that the restaurant industry as a whole suffers from is a lack of mentorship, a lack of resources, a lack of training, right? That For a lot of restaurants, it's fly by the seat of your pants. It's we'll figure it out. We're going to get through this service. It's a very short-sighted view and positioning. So one of our solutions for that is one of the products we offer is mentorship, right? It's one of our least expensive products, right? That we sell to restaurants because I have conversations with operators all the time. And I ask them simply like, what does your beverage staff structure look like? Oh, I have a beverage director and we have some SOMs on the floor. Great. How do you hold them accountable? Who manages them? Who has the skill set to understand what it is they're doing or what they need to be doing and holding them accountable to the business? And 9 times out of 10, it's, well, no one, they have experience. So we assume that they're doing a good job. And that assumption can be catastrophic, right? So, how we work is, we'll come in and we'll sort of we'll begin dissecting and understanding the ecosystem and looking at the business and seeing what's happening and understanding where opportunities are and where strategies need to be adjusted or applied, where to install systems. And we'll work with that person and say, hey, not for nothing, we ran pretty big beverage programs. We're kind of good at this. These are the gaps we see. This is what you should be doing. This is how you should be handling some of these administrative features or some of these architectural features or some of these strategies, right? Try this, and this, and let's see what happens. And once again, 9 times out of 10, when they listen, things get better.
So in the end, it's not just consulting, it's actively rebuilding the foundational expertise within these establishments.
I mean, it's one of the goals for sure. I mean, look, like I said earlier, I've been in restaurants my entire life. I am obsessed with restaurants. I love restaurants. My wife drives my wife crazy. But I'm a lifer, and I've unfortunately aged out in some ways in terms of I can't hump service the way I once did. But I want to be useful to the industry. I've spent a lifetime learning about beverage and executing beverage, and like I said, I think there's an opportunity in here for more of this, and you're seeing more of this pop up. Right.
Right.
In the business, adjacent to the business, you're seeing a lot of people with a ton of experience trying to help. And I think that that's a good trend in general.
Great. So finally, Brad, looking ahead, if you had to make one bold prediction about the future of beverage programs in luxury hospitality, perhaps a trend or innovation that most people aren't fully grasping yet, what would it be?
My mind jumps to AI almost
Mm-hmm.
immediately.
Right.
It's such a powerful tool. I don't know how much AI has infected your life day to day, month to month, but for me, it's astounding how much I use it now, and it's astounding its use cases. And look, I don't think AI is going to replace servers or bartenders, right? I think that hospitality is an area where you'll always need a human in the loop, if you will, right? But I think AI is really going to take over the tech side of the industry. And my hope is that AI is going to make, some fundamental things much easier.
Yeah.
Accounting, P&L generation, processing invoices, right? Like the nuts and bolts work, make that easier that operators really don't have time for and they don't want to be bothered with. If you're a general manager or a beverage director, like your default mechanism should be service. Your default mechanism should be taking care of guests and generating sales, right? That's what you're there to do. That's what a restaurant is. A restaurant sells food and beverage fundamentally. And there's all this noise in the industry about data and, tech and how it can make your job easier. And what I see is in most restaurants, tech makes someone's job harder because it's one more thing they have to manage.
Right.
So I would love to see that get easier.
Okay. Well, thank you. Brad, your insights have been incredibly sharp and actionable. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and experiences with us today.
Pleasure, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to Leading in Luxury. For those of you striving for excellence and looking to optimize every facet of your luxury hospitality business, I encourage you to reflect on Brad's powerful insights. If you're ready to elevate your beverage program and drive significant profitability, be sure to like this episode and subscribe to Leading in Luxury for more expert interviews. I'm Daniel Renna. See you next time.